So what does it mean to have optimal gut health? I think that's a good place where we can start this discussion. And I think that it really means it's the absence of any type of discomfortable gut symptoms. So bloating, pain, excess of frequent defecation, inability to defecate, mucus or blood in the stools. So all these things that many people think are normal, they're not normal. So I believe that everyone should be, and your biology is programmed to give you regular, smooth bowel habits. And whether that is once a day, whether that's once every 2 days, it should be a painless process, and it should be a smooth and regular process. And when we understand circadian biology and the effect of light on our circadian rhythms, this will make a bit more sense. But to start with that, people shouldn't be tolerating gastrointestinal discomfort as a norm. And a lot of people need to be told that because they've lived with gastrointestinal state of pain or discomfort that they think is normal. But I'm here to tell you that that's not normal, and you can do something about it. So what is the spectrum of gut health? And this goes all the way from feeling great, like I mentioned, no problems whatsoever, to maybe you have some constipation, maybe you have some difficulty defecating, and then up to things that can really start to impacting people's quality of life. So as I mentioned, bloating, both constipation predominant irritable bowel syndrome or diarrhea predominant irritable bowel syndrome, and then all the way up to really severe medical problems, which something like celiac disease, like inflammatory bowel disease, where you're actually bleeding or you're having systemic illness that needs treatment with heavy medications. So it's a spectrum, and even though it's a spectrum, it has underlying causal pathways, and that's to do with the integrity of your gut barrier. So let me explain that. So as I mentioned, everyone is entitled to optimal gut health if you can get the inputs right. So what I'm going to talk about, why the gut barrier function is key, how light and circadian rhythms affect your gut barrier, the dietary factors, and specifically the effect of dietary deuterium on the gut, and also why fully grass-fed beef is best. And I'm going to specifically explain to you why, if possible, you can source beef from a fully grass-fed source. So this is the human gut, and I really loved what Stacey had to say about the variation in human anatomy. But essentially, the food goes in the top. There's your stomach. You have your liver, pancreas, small intestine, large intestine. This process, this is where the digestion occurs. So it's got a range of functions, but what is relevant to understand is that this is exposed to the external environment. It is colonized by these bacteria that we can pick up from the environment, and it has had some very specific evolutionary trade-offs, and Jalal made mention of this specifically with regard to the shortening of the gut. So this slide is only to show you what the gut looks like if you cut it right down in a transverse section. And what you can see is that in the middle is where your poo lives. So this is the lumen of the gut, and that mucus barrier is key. So what you can see here is that there is a mucus barrier that is in health is intact, and above those cells is a mucus layer that is protecting everything in the gut and protecting your body from the contents of the gut. So what happens is that when we get sick, the barrier function of the gut is impaired. And this is what happens in something like ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease, where you get wholesale damage of that gut lining. But what I mentioned earlier is that the spectrum of gut disease is a spectrum of gut permeability. And even though you might not have histologically proved disease or full-blown inflammatory bowel disease, there is some degree of gastrointestinal permeability and gut barrier permeability. So the factors that I really want to address in my talk is how can light and how can our diet both influence our gut health. So let's talk about light first. And to understand light, we have to understand this concept of our circadian rhythm. And many of you might be aware of what a circadian rhythm is, but essentially it is this intrinsic clock timing mechanism that allows our body to time all of the processes that is occurring inside the body. And if there is uncertainty, if there is chaos about the timing of specific functions, then the body is not going to function properly. The most important input into this system is light, and that is the natural sunlight that we have evolved with. The confusing part of modern life that I'm going to talk in the rest of this talk about is that these light signals that we normally require and have become used to over the period of our evolutionary past are no longer the case. We've had artificial light, we've had compact fluorescent bulbs, we've had LED bulbs replace full spectrum sunlight as the chief light cue that is programming this circadian rhythm. And if you think about this as a pure input-output system, if you change the input, you're going to get a different output. And whereas we've had full spectrum sunlight for the longest time, now we've got isolated blue light, and that is a major problem for gut health. And that is not anything that people are really recognizing. So, natural sunlight is visible light, but it is also non-visible light. So the visible spectrum, or the terrestrial spectrum, the light that we get here on planet Earth, is visible between 400 and 700 nanometers, but it is also below that. It is also UV light, and it is also infrared light. And each one of these wavelengths can be thought of as medicine. Each one of them is an input into the system. And if you remove or you alter that spectrum, you are going to get an undesirable biological outcome. So that is a very key point to understand. This is another way of looking at the same thing. This is the spectrum of light that we get standing on planet Earth. What you can see is that even though ultraviolet light is critical, it only makes up a tiny part of the light that hits us when we're sitting here. And this is because it is a short wavelength. But we need it. We need it for vitamin D synthesis. We need it for a bunch of really important factors. Visible light, as Jalal said, look how balanced that spectrum is. Whenever there's blue, there's also red. There's never blue by itself. And wherever there's visible light, there's infrared light. And almost half of the light that we're exposed to is not even visible. And that is another incredibly important point that no one isn't talked about, is that your light needs aren't even visible. And when you were outside, when your great-grandparents were outside, they were being exposed to this non-visible light that has had really important biological effects. And when we're indoors, under LEDs, and blocked from our normal light environment, we're being deprived not only of infrared and UV, but also full-spectrum visible light. So keep that in mind. And that is like, if we're thinking about the nutrients that we need to thrive from a food point of view, these are the nutrients you need to thrive on from a light point of view. So the circadian rhythm is this clock timing mechanism. And I specifically use the yin and yang symbol because it really gives us an idea about the duality of your circadian needs. So the light is the sunlight. So you need full spectrum, bright sunlight during the day, and just as importantly, you need complete absence of light at night. So you can't have one without the other. You can't hope to have optimal circadian health with just going out during the day into bright sunlight, but then have your bedroom lit up like JB Hi-Fi. It's not going to work. You need both arms of this coupled system to be intact if you are going to feed your body the optimal circadian signals. So the term circa means approximately or around. So it's just about 24-hour timing mechanism, but not quite, meaning that's why we need that light from the sun to program and update the clock. And like I mentioned, it's coordinating all your bodily functions, including your gut functions. And this is why gut health is so much more than just what we're putting in our gut. And again, that point is emphasized. So how does light regulate our gut? And basically, the reasons that it does that is because those light signals are telling your gut when to contract, when to push the poo out, when to secrete the enzymes you need to digest your food. This process is incredibly timed and optimized. And if you think about trying to design a system that is the most efficient, then it would not be looking to digest food at 3 a.m. at the nighttime. Your body is in healing mode at 3 a.m. at the nighttime. So do you think that eating a meal at 3 a.m. at nighttime is a good idea? I mean, that is self-evident that is a bad idea. So respecting our gut, our circadian rhythm is optimizing our gut health. And the reasons specifically why it also is relevant is that the gut lining, those cells that I showed you in that diagram, are getting turned over every 3 to 5 days, but they require the correct circadian signals in order to turn over properly. They also, the barrier leakiness, so the degree to which that those cells are able to stick together and stay together and protect you from the inflammatory contents of the gut, is going to be a function of how well you respect the light during the day and the darkness during the night. So this is a summary. If we are respecting our circadian rhythms, we have regular sleep times, regular sleeping times, we avoid artificial light at night, then we are helping optimize our circadian, our gut function at all these different levels. But if we are misaligning our circadian rhythm, if we're working shift work, if we're jet lagged, if we have social jet lag, which is code for what your teenage children do every Saturday night, at the club, that is an irregular eating, that is all going to contribute to poor gut health, including things like inflammatory bowel disease and those other conditions that I mentioned earlier. So that's fine. What we really need to understand about this light problem is, again, it's a twofold problem. We need enough bright light during the day, and we need enough darkness during night. So both sides of the coin are important and are key. So if we take it to the next step, let's think about another aspect of sunlight and health, and that is what we would get during the day under full spectrum sunlight. So ultraviolet light, like I mentioned, is a certain part of the electromagnetic frequency that you get. It is critical for making vitamin D, and that is specifically UVB radiation. UVB has been maligned and it has been demonized in the mainstream health space, specifically on advice from dermatology profession who are worried about people getting skin cancers. There's a lot of irregularities and inconsistencies with the demonization of UV light, particularly the key finding that people who get melanoma are overwhelmingly vitamin D deficient, and those who are vitamin D deficient have a worse prognosis of melanoma. So there's lots of holes in the UV light story and the UV light and health story that won't be the topic of this discussion, but suffice to say, vitamin D is a critical part of your health, and not only of bone health, but also of immune health. And it is made when we get ultraviolet light on our skin. The key point to understand, and especially when we're looking at things like medical research, is that your serum vitamin D level, or the vitamin D level that we measure in your blood, can be thought of as just an approximator or proxy of your sun status. So I can tell when I see a patient's vitamin D level if they're the type of person that stays indoors all day, avoids the sun, or is someone who is active outdoors and therefore getting more sunlight. So the underlying problem with vitamin D deficiency is so pervasive that all the chronic diseases that we see are almost invariably related to vitamin D deficiency. And if we take that and relate that to what Dr. Jalal mentioned about our mitochondrial function, it's because if we are sunlight deficient, then our mitochondria are not going to be working properly. And all those chronic diseases, the diabetes, the dementia, heart disease, heart failure, neurodegeneration, they're all functions of mitochondrial failure at some level, and a chronic mitochondrial failure. So depriving yourself of sunlight, and I'm going to explain exactly how sunlight affects mitochondrial function. Depriving yourself of sunlight is a shortcut to the nursing home. So how does vitamin D status affect the gut? Well, there's lots of ways. So you have vitamin D receptors in your gut lining, and you can see that when vitamin D is sufficient, when your body is making enough vitamin D, all the proteins that regulate the integrity of that gut barrier are going to be upregulated. That includes things like that keep the cells nice and bound together. So gut permeability and leaky gut is going to be a function of your sunlight exposure. That is what this slide shows you. The more sun you can get in a safe way that respects your skin type, the healthier your gut function is going to be. And specifically with regard to inflammation and the role of vitamin D in providing us a healthy immune system can't be overstated. And that is both in preventing us from overreacting to certain compounds, which causes autoimmune disease, but also in making sure the immune system replies or attacks those pathogens properly. So when when COVID or any other seasonal influenza respiratory virus sweeps through, who gets the sickest? It's those with vitamin D deficiency, and that has been a very, very consistent finding. Who gets MS? It's those who are vitamin D deficient. It's an extremely strong associational marker of and predictor of immune dysfunction. So this is to say how integral that the sunlight is to your gut health, and through one pathway, which is your vitamin D status. So let's look at a couple of examples, because I've described the process, but do we actually know this for a fact? And we do know that if you have low vitamin D, then your risk of getting gut disorders goes up. So vitamin D deficiency, and whenever I've written vitamin D deficiency, you have to think sunlight deficiency. A vitamin D deficiency is a sunlight deficiency. Is associated with irritable bowel syndrome, inflammatory bowel disease, celiac disease, and that is that's quite apparent. So you can't really read that too well, but it says that vitamin D deficiency is closely related to irritable bowel syndrome occurrence, development, and complications. The prevalence of vitamin D deficiency in people with irritable bowel syndrome is as high as 82%. So think about that for someone who is having gut symptoms, and maybe it's a prompt to think about when was the last time that person was in the sun or deliberately went into the sun. So another paper showed that inflammatory bowel disease, so Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, that are incredibly debilitating and have effects including requiring immunosuppression and other kinds of very intense medical treatment, have higher odds of vitamin D deficiency because they're having this degree of immune dysfunction from a lack of sun. And finally, vitamin D could play a role in controlling both the development and the course of celiac disease and inflammatory bowel disease. So again, sunlight is key. Sunlight is key to gut health, and that point really can't be overstated. So I mentioned a bit before about the natural sunlight spectrum, and I talked about this area here. So this area here is infrared light, and infrared light or longer wavelength light has amazing properties or effects on the body. So if we've talked about your UV light, and UV light plays a role in vitamin D synthesis. We've talked about, I'll quickly mention visible light, and we need blue light. We need natural blue light. It helps promote cortisol. It helps us wake up in the morning. But as I mentioned, it's always balanced with those other wavelengths. So infrared makes up the most of the photons that we get standing on planet Earth. And so what it does is it actually penetrates deep into the body, even with clothing on, and it hits those mitochondria. And when it hits those mitochondria, they make melatonin. And melatonin, which the gentleman mentioned earlier, is a very, very old and diverse compound. It's not only a compound that puts you to sleep at night on the absence of a daylight or blue light, but it also dampens down oxidative stress. And if you remember the diagram about the mitochondria and the occurrence of reactive oxygen species, melatonin is the protector of that mitochondrial DNA, and melatonin is key. So near-infrared light can penetrate up to 8 centimeters, 10 centimeters into the body. That has fascinating implications because the modern indoor lighting environment is deprived of infrared. This is so important that for children, if you think about, because their body status their size is smaller, 100% of their cells are going to be able to be bathed in near infrared light if they're walking outside. For adults, it's closer to 60% of your cells. But if you think about 10 centimeters deep, wherever you are, that is the amount of tissue that can be influenced on a biological level by this wavelength of sunlight that you can't see and that you can't feel. Far infrared you can feel as heat, near infrared you can't even feel. So the importance of being outside and getting infrared light for health is very difficult to overstate. And you're getting none of it. If you live in an office, you're not going to get any of it. If you live indoors with with the glasses and with glass, or any type of modern glassing is going to block most of the near infrared light. So it's deprived of infrared light. And what you can see is that in natural sunlight, we have, as I mentioned earlier, mostly near infrared. So how does this relate to gut health? And how can we think about this in terms of our natural evolved needs? Well, if we evolved outside for the duration of our ancestral past, then we would have had abundant access to these near infrared photons that are impinging directly onto our gut and providing a direct antioxidant source or stimulus for an antioxidant source, so our body and our cells can make melatonin. So all that to say, and I really recommend that paper, Melatonin and the Optics of the Human Body, to understand how critical this infrared light story is for health. But all that to say, if you think about gut health and you think about light and gut health, is that the process of exposing your abdomen to the sun is facilitating an abundant amount of near infrared photons to pass through your tissue. And your gut is a superficially located organ. It's not far. It's easily amenable to that infrared light. So what we can really think about when you understand the different parts of the light spectrum in the daytime, as well as the circadian rhythm, then you can really understand that a lot of our gut disorders are a problem of sunlight and circadian rhythm, which again is not something that people are really realizing. So let's talk about diet now, and this is the other part of the stool. And when I talk to patients and I emphasize my message, I talk about our light diet and our food diet. So what about the dietary factors are going to be influencing our gut health? So again, let's go back to this diagram. Let's think about the gut lining, and let's think about things that either protect or help that gut lining integrity, or factors that are going to essentially attack our body's ability to maintain a strict gut barrier. So there's a couple, and I've listed 6 here that I think are the most important. Those are processed foods, particularly seed oils, also grains, but all the types of processed foods that you might find in the supermarket aisle that Stacey has talked about. And there are so many factors that relate to the harm of processed foods for your health, things that I'm not going to mention, including emulsifiers, including food additives, that are themselves another whole rabbit hole. But they are inherently in a package toxic to your gut lining. The factors that I'm not going to make too much of a mention on is certain medications, particularly non-steroidal anti-inflammatory medications, and alcohol. And it's been known for a very long time that drinking a large amount of alcohol, or even a little bit of alcohol, for someone who has a friable or vulnerable gut is not helpful at all. But I'm going to make a quick mention of the the industrial herbicide, glyphosate, and certain plant compounds. So the role of, or the impact of glyphosate on the gut is it's basically the first point of contact for glyphosate in terms of human health. And we alluded to it earlier in the presentation, that glyphosate is having multiple effects at multiple different levels on human health. The gut is just the first point of contact that this herbicide is having. And look, for context, let's make it clear that the reason why the Australian Herbicide, Pesticide and Veterinary Association still hasn't banned glyphosate is because it's based on a fundamental premise that humans don't contain an enzymatic pathway by which glyphosate kills plants. That's called the shikimate pathway. So the safety or the regulatory pass that glyphosate has in Australia and other countries is based on an assumption that if we don't have the shikimate pathway in our mammalian cells, then it is benign. The problem with that is that our gut microbiota have this shikimate pathway, and glyphosate is acting like an antibiotic for our gut microbiota. And if you're consuming food that has been desiccated recently, and that is another whole topic about the use of glyphosate in agriculture, it's not only used, as many of you would know, many of you are farmers, it's not only used as in Roundup Ready or genetically modified organisms, it is now being used as a crop desiccant to facilitate and expedite the process of harvesting. So that point, or that decision to use glyphosate on the field has got nothing to do with your health. It has not been carefully made in consideration with biologists or holistic practitioners. It's simply to aid in the profitability of industrial monocrop agriculture. So glyphosate is fundamentally altering the gut microbiota. It is causing overgrowth of pathogenic microbes, as well as impairing our ability to get rid of deuterium, which I'm going to mention a bit later. It's an endocrine disruptor. It chelates heavy metals, so causing things like zinc and copper deficiency in the body. There's so many reasons why glyphosate is toxic to human health, and we haven't even mentioned about the substitution for glycine. So it really needs to get out of the food system as soon as possible. But in absence or in lieu of any kind of coherent regulatory action, you need to take it upon yourself to consume foods that are free from glyphosate. So again, the point that I want to make is that these are going to exacerbate that underlying dysfunction in your gut function. So if your light signals are wrong, these are going to be bigger players than if someone like the Hadza gentleman in the African savannah. He's grounded. He's got a completely regulated circadian rhythm. He is eating hyperlocal food. So his ability to deal with these type of toxins is much, much higher than those of us who have to live under artificial light and deal with the other consequences of modern living. A quick mention of hydrogen and deuterium. So Jalal made mention of this quickly, but it is an isotope of hydrogen that is particularly a problem for our mitochondria. So the way to think about it is, if hydrogen is like a little ute, then deuterium is like the G-Wagon. It's double the size. And this is an incredible problem for your mitochondria that evolved specifically to use hydrogen in its mitochondrial metabolic machinery. So quite simply is that the mitochondria, which you learned about before, is harmed by when it is trying to put deuterium instead of a hydrogen through that fifth complex of the electron transport chain. So this, when you eat foods that are high in deuterium and you don't live in an ancestral way that allows your body to naturally deplete yourself of deuterium, then you're going to break this fifth complex of your electron transport chain. You're going to get mitochondrial dysfunction, and the disease that you get depends on which organ fails first. And that is, again, the mitochondrial bioenergetic etiology of disease. So how does that relate to processed foods? Well, it just turns out that seed oils and processed foods are enriched in deuterium, and they're enriched in deuterium because of both the photosynthetic process that grew them, but also the industrial manufacturing process. So you can see that refined seed oils between 170 and 120 parts per million. And for reference, the fats that we were told to not eat for the past 5 decades are essentially the most deuterium depleted food. That means they are the most suitable mitochondrial fuel. And that is, again, the complete opposite to what we've been told in terms of butter scare tactics, saturated fat scare tactics. But the animal-derived fats are the lowest in deuterium, and that makes them most suitable. And, analogy that gets used is, what do the Sherpa eat when they are carrying, a fat gringo up Mount Everest? What are they eating? They're eating grass-fed butter. They're in deep ketosis, they're in deep nutritional ketosis, their mitochondria are humming. Their Ferrari engines are finely tuned because they're running on grass-fed animal fat on a highly deuterium depleted diet, getting massive amounts of ultraviolet light. So this is again something that you've been told that is completely wrong, which is that these saturated animal fats are here to give us heart disease. It's not correct, and we can understand that when we talk about deuterium and mitochondrial function. And that is data from Dr. Laszlo Boros, the Hungarian researchers. So what's a dietary approach to fix severe gut barrier dysfunction? And I'm going to make a quick mention of it. And that is what this trade-off that we made as a species. And that trade-off was a shortening of our colon for a lengthening of our small intestine. The reason is we didn't need to ferment carbohydrates and plant matter to derive short-chain fatty acids anymore. Why? Because we had a spear and a knife, and we could kill and hunt animals and therefore absorb fat as a fuel source, as a nutrient source, high in our small intestine. And that is why we have made that anatomical trade-off. So what it means is that there were periods of our time in our ancestral past where we were hypercarnivorous, and that was the period of Homo erectus. So the way they found this was by looking at bone samples and calculating through a process of special analysis the presence of different isotopes of nitrogen, of carbon. You can therefore infer what's called a trophic level or a food chain based on the presence or the bioaccumulation of these isotopes. What they found specifically around 40,000 years ago is that we were hypercarnivorous, meaning we're eating other carnivorous animals. So we're no longer that anymore, but it speaks to the benefit or at a certain point that we can use a carnivorous type diet. So a carnivorous type diet works so well is because it is essentially excluding a whole bunch of toxins to the gut barrier that are particularly problematic in people who have a compromised immune gut function. And depending on where you source your meat is going to be whether you get out additional things like glyphosate as well. So the other point, and I think this speaks to why we're here about eating Bryant's grass-fed beef, is because this is the most deuterium depleted type of food, the fully grass-fed beef. And work by Dr. Boros showed that grain feeding of cattle in place of pasture-based feeding induces mitochondrial deuterium depletion deficiency and thereby impairs the deuterium depleting function of the mitochondrial matrix during milk and meat production. This means that, if possible, eating fully grass-fed beef is preferable. So what are the implications? The more sunlight deprived you are, the poorer your gut health is going to be. The more circadian disrupted you are, the poorer gut health you're going to have. The greater glyphosate contamination of your food, the more need for a diet that is completely derived of any type of phytotoxin. And that is not necessarily ideal. We want you to get to a stage where you can eat things like phytotoxin, like plants, and not fall in a heap. But for those who are incredibly sick from a gut point of view, this can be an effective approach. So how do we optimize our gut health based on these? So what are these takeaways? What we need to do is we need to normalize our circadian rhythm. We need to block artificial light and maximize the sunlight that we get during the day, specifically getting sunlight on our abdomen if we are particularly sick. We need to build a solar callus and get our vitamin D level to a sufficient level. And supplementation does not get you the same benefits of vitamin D repletion as getting UV light based sun. If you are pale, as most people here have of Northern European descent, you need less UV light to make more vitamin D. So that needs to be taken into account. And finally, for those who are sick, who have the sickest gastrointestinal symptoms, a strict carnivore diet is highly effective and will fix you. How long you need to stay carnivore is going to be a function of how well you fix the other inputs, including your circadian rhythm, including your other food sourcing. But like I said, it's ideal that we can heal you to a stage where you can get back to eating other foods without falling in a heap. So if you want to learn more, I've got some courses specifically about circadian health, and soon to be released one about developing a solar callus, building that vitamin D level up in a way that will not predispose you to developing skin cancer, because we need to do this safely and harness the health benefits of sunlight without increasing skin cancer risk, which can be done. But again, this is not something that's really popularized or even emphasized by a pharmaceutical-based system that makes money off people remaining patients. And I've also got a private group, and it's been a pleasure to see Beverly and Audra and Leo and Libby. Thank you, my members who've come to watch today. So we have some great discussions there, and I have a weekly Q&A where I can answer questions for people in all along these topics. So thank you very much, and that's some social media handles and my podcast and other ways you can get in contact with me. Thank you for listening.